Yo, picture this. It's 1914, the vibes in Europe are tense like that awkward silence in an elevator after someone farts. The air is thick with anticipation, and everyone seems to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The political climate is like a powder keg, just waiting for a spark to set it off. Everyone's flexing their military muscles, forming alliances like they're picking teams for dodgeball, and holding on to their colonies like they're the last slice of pizza. The major powers are all trying to outdo each other, showing off their latest weapons and military strategies. It's a game of one-upmanship, and no one wants to be left behind. Enter Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, heir to a crumbling empire, and let's be real, not the sharpest tool in the shed. He's got big plans, but not everyone is on board with his vision for the future. His presence is more of a symbol of the old ways, and many see him as out of touch with the changing times. He decides to visit Sarajevo, which, bad timing alert, is basically a hotbed of Serbian nationalism. The city is a melting pot of political tensions, and his visit is seen as a provocation by many. The streets are filled with whispers of rebellion, and the atmosphere is electric with the possibility of conflict. Now, I'm not saying this assassination was inevitable, but let's just say the Archduke's security detail was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. His visit is poorly planned, and the security measures are laughably inadequate. It's almost as if they were inviting trouble. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, after what I can only assume was a very confusing morning, finds himself face-to-face with the Archduke's open car. Princip, a member of the Black Hand, a secret society committed to Serbian independence, sees his chance to make a statement. Bang! One shot, and just like that, Ferdinand and his wife are history. The assassination sends shockwaves through Europe, and the news spreads like wildfire. It's the spark that ignites the powder keg, and there's no turning back. This wasn't just any assassination though. It was the match thrown onto a pile of dry tinder. The political landscape is already volatile, and this act of violence sets off a chain reaction that no one can control. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, their ride or die, issues Serbia an ultimatum so harsh it would make a drill sergeant blush. The demands are impossible to meet, and it's clear that Austria-Hungary is looking for an excuse to go to war. Serbia's like, hold up, we can explain, but Austria-Hungary ain't trying to hear it. The diplomatic efforts are half-hearted at best, and both sides are gearing up for a fight. They declare war, and boom, the dominoes start falling. The alliances that were meant to keep the peace now pull everyone into the conflict. Russia, feeling all buddy-buddy with Serbia, steps in. They mobilize their troops, ready to defend their Slavic brothers. Germany, not one to be shown up, declares war on Russia. They see this as their chance to assert dominance and prove their military might. France, obligated by their treaty with Russia because nothing says friendship like a legally binding agreement to join someone else's war, jumps in too. They can't afford to let Germany gain the upper hand. And Great Britain, seeing a continental brawl about to go down, figures, why not? And joins the party. They have their own interests to protect, and they can't stay on the sidelines. Just like that, the Great War, later known as World War I, explodes onto the scene. The world is plunged into a conflict of unprecedented scale, and the consequences will be felt for generations. Talk about your international incidents. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off a chain of events that reshaped the world, proving that sometimes a single moment can change the course of history. You see, the assassination was just the trigger. It was the spark that ignited a powder keg that had been filling up for years, even decades. The tensions were already sky high, and it only took one small event to set off a chain reaction that would engulf the entire continent. Europe had been simmering in a stew of its own making for decades. The continent was a complex web of political, economic, and social tensions, each thread pulling tighter and tighter until something had to give. Think of it like this. World War I was basically a giant potluck, and everyone brought their own brand of crazy. First, you got militarism. Countries were obsessed with building up their military power, convinced that the only way to ensure peace was to be ready for war. Every country was flexing its military might, building bigger armies and navies like they were collecting stamps. It was an arms race on a massive scale, with each nation trying to outdo the others in a show of strength and preparedness. It was like a giant, deadly game of keeping up with the Joneses, except instead of fancy cars, it was battleships and machine guns. The more one country built, the more others felt compelled to match or exceed that buildup. Then there's alliances. those pacts between countries that are basically the international relations equivalent of bros before hoes. Except in this case, it's more like bros before peace treaties. These alliances were meant to provide security, but they also created a domino effect. These alliances meant that if one country went to war, their buddies were obligated to jump in too, whether they wanted to or not. It was a tangled web of obligations and promises that made it almost impossible to avoid a larger conflict once the first shot was fired. Let's not forget imperialism. European powers had been gobbling up colonies like they were going out of style, scrambling for resources and power. This race for colonies created intense rivalries and conflicts far from European shores, but the tensions always had a way of coming back home. This created a whole lot of tension and resentment, especially among those being colonized. The exploited colonies were like pressure cookers, ready to explode, and the European powers were often too busy competing with each other to notice the growing unrest. And finally, you have nationalism, that potent cocktail of pride, patriotism, and sometimes a healthy dose of my country is better than yours. Nationalism was more than just a sense of pride, it was a driving force that pushed nations to assert their dominance and protect their interests at all costs. Nationalism was running high in the early 20th century, pushing people to fight for their nation, even if it meant sacrificing their lives for a few more miles of disputed territory. It was a powerful motivator that often blinded people to the larger consequences of their actions. Mix all these ingredients together, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, and you've got yourself a recipe for disaster. Each element on its own was already volatile, but together, they created a perfect storm that was just waiting for a spark. It was only a matter of time before something set the whole thing off. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was that spark, but the fire had been building for a long time, fueled by a complex mix of ambitions, fears, and rivalries that no one could control. Now, I'm no military strategist, but even I can tell you that World War I was not your grandma's war. It was a conflict that redefined the very nature of warfare, introducing a level of destruction and human suffering that the world had never seen before. This wasn't about dashing cavalry charges and heroic duels. The romanticized image of war was shattered by the grim reality of trench warfare and industrialized killing. This was a new kind of war, a brutal, industrialized slugfest that shocked the world with its savagery. The scale of the conflict was unprecedented, with entire nations mobilizing their economies and populations for the war effort. Imagine this: millions of men crammed into muddy trenches that stretched for miles, facing off against each other in a deadly game of wait and see. These trenches were not just temporary shelters, they became the soldiers' homes for months, even years. New weapons like machine guns, poison gas, and tanks made their debut, turning the battlefield into a terrifying hellscape. The introduction of these weapons changed the dynamics of combat, making it more lethal and impersonal. The Western Front, stretching through France and Belgium, became a nightmarish symbol of the war's brutality. The landscape was scarred with craters, barbed wire, and the remnants of once thriving villages. Battles like the Somme and Verdun became synonymous with unimaginable carnage, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers dying for mere yards of land. These battles were characterized by their sheer scale and the staggering loss of life. It was a war of attrition, a grim calculus of death and destruction. The goal was not just to defeat the enemy, but to wear them down to the point of collapse. And don't even get me started on the Eastern Front, where the fighting was just as brutal, if not more so. The vast expanses of the Eastern Front saw some of the most intense and deadly battles of the war. From the frozen wastelands of Russia to the mountains of the Caucasus, millions more fought and died. The harsh conditions added another layer of suffering to the already brutal conflict. The sheer scale of the fighting was mind-blowing. Entire regions were transformed into battlefields, and the impact on civilian populations was devastating. Years dragged on, and the war settled into a deadly stalemate. The initial hopes of a quick victory faded as both sides dug in for a prolonged and grueling conflict. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the fighting continued, month after bloody month, year after agonizing year. The human cost was staggering, with millions of lives lost and countless others forever changed. It was a war that seemed like it would never end. The world watched in horror as the conflict dragged on, leaving a legacy of destruction and sorrow that would shape the course of history for generations to come.